Greta Weber's hands wouldn't stop shaking. At 19 years old, she had spent the last 3 years believing one absolute truth. If Black American soldiers ever captured her, death would be merciful compared to what would come first. Now, on April 23, 1945, that nightmare had become reality. As what happened next would shatter everything the Third Reich had taught her. The morning started like any other at the Wehrmacht communications facility in rural Bavaria. Greta sat at her post, headphones pressed against her ears, transcribing coded messages that made less sense with each passing day. The Reich was collapsing. Everyone knew it, though no one dared speak it aloud. 3 years earlier, she had volunteered as a Wehrmachthelferin, a Wehrmacht auxiliary, proud to serve the fatherland. Her role was simple: operate radio equipment, relay messages, support the war effort from behind the lines. Women weren't supposed to fight, but they could certainly help Germany win. Except Germany wasn't winning any. The messages she transcribed told stories of retreat, encirclement, and surrender. Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory every single day. The facility commander, an aging Wehrmacht officer named Hauptmann Schneider, had stopped pretending weeks ago. His face carried the gray pallor of a man who knew the end had arrived. At 08:20 hours, the distinctive rumble of tank engines echoed across the Bavarian hills. Not German tanks, American. Greta's supervisor, Oberfeldwebel Krause, appeared in the doorway of the communications room, his face ashen. Simply said 3 words that changed everything. "They're here." No evacuation order came. No desperate last stand. Hauptmann Schneider gathered the entire facility staff in the central courtyard. 25 women, ranging from Greta's 19 years to the oldest. A 42-year-old administrator named Frau Holzer. They stood in neat rows, uniforms pressed despite everything, trained discipline holding even as their world ended. The American tanks rolled through the gates. Greta had never seen Sherman tanks up close. They looked massive, unstoppable, their engines growling like mechanical beasts. But it wasn't the tanks that made her blood turn to ice. It was the soldiers climbing out of them. Black soldiers, Negro troops. The exact nightmare every piece of propaganda had warned about for years. Greta's mind flooded with images she had seen 1,000 times. Posters plastered across every German city showing caricatures of black soldiers as savage, animalistic threats to civilization itself. Hitler Youth lectures describing them as racially inferior, mentally deficient, prone to violence and barbarism. Her own mother had gripped her shoulders before she left for Wehrmacht service and whispered urgently about what to do if Negro troops ever captured her. "Pray they kill you quickly, Greta. Pray for that mercy." Now those soldiers stood 20 meters away, rifles ready, surrounding the courtyard. Greta's legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the arm of the woman next to her, Liesel, a 17-year-old filing clerk who had started crying the moment the tanks appeared. Other women clutched each other, some openly weeping, some frozen in terror. Hauptmann Schneider stepped forward, removed his sidearm with deliberate slowness, and placed it on the ground. His voice carried across the courtyard in crisp German. "This facility surrenders to American forces. All personnel will comply fully with captor instructions." An American officer, white, approached and accepted the surrender. Greta couldn't hear the conversation, but she watched as Wehrmacht personnel were separated into groups. Male soldiers to one area, officers to another, and the women auxiliaries to a third. An American sergeant approached their group, and Greta's heart hammered so violently she thought it might burst through her chest. The sergeant was black, tall, maybe 28 years old, with sharp eyes that swept across them with professional assessment. He wore the insignia of the 761st Tank Battalion on his uniform. His face carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much combat, but his voice remained steady and firm when he spoke. Another American soldier, also black, translated his words into heavily accented but understandable German. "You are prisoners of war of the United States Army. You will be transported to a processing facility. You will not be harmed if you comply with instructions. Gather your personal items. You have 10 minutes. That was all. No threats. No violence. Just instructions." Greta didn't believe it for a second. This was the prelude, the calm before the horror. They were being gathered for transport to somewhere private, somewhere the screams wouldn't carry. Every fiber of propaganda fed certainty in her body screamed that this was exactly how it would happen. The 10 minutes passed in a blur of tears and whispered prayers. Greta grabbed her small suitcase, packed with a few changes of clothes. a photograph of her family, and a worn copy of her mother's letters. Around her, other women did the same, moving like automatons, faces pale with dread. They were loaded onto American military trucks. The canvas covering created a dim, enclosed space where 25 terrified women pressed together. Greta found herself next to an older woman she recognized as Margarethe Fisher, a nurse who had served in field hospitals on the Eastern Front before transferring to this administrative posting. Margarethe's face remained composed, but Greta could see her hands gripping her medical bag with white-knuckled intensity. "What will they do to us?" Lisa whispered, her voice breaking. No one answered because everyone knew, or thought they knew. The propaganda had been explicit, relentless, and utterly convincing. For years, the Reich's educational system, its media, its leaders had described black soldiers as dangerous subhumans, incapable of restraint or civilization. Greta had absorbed these messages like oxygen. She had never questioned them. Until now, she had never had reason to. The truck rumbled through devastated German countryside. Through gaps in the canvas, Greta glimpsed burned-out buildings, crater-pocked roads, and the scattered debris of a dying regime. The journey lasted maybe 40 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the truck stopped and the canvas was pulled back, harsh sunlight flooded in. Greta blinked, momentarily blinded, then focused on the building before them. It looked like a converted school, 3 stories of solid German architecture that had been requisitioned for military purposes. American flags hung from the entrance. Guards stood at regular intervals, all of them black soldiers, all armed. The same sergeant from the capture site stood at the building entrance. He consulted a clipboard, then nodded to the translator. "Single file. You will be processed. Roll call, medical examination, assignment to quarters. Maintain order." They filed into what had once been a school assembly hall. Tables were set up with administrative stations. American soldiers, both black and white, sat behind them with forms and typewriters. One by one, the German women approached for processing. When Greta's turn came, she stood before a young black corporal who looked barely older than herself. He asked her name in English. The translator, a corporal named Marcus Johnson, according to his nameplate, repeated the question in German. Greta's voice came out as barely a whisper. Greta Weber. Age? 19. Rank and position? Wehrmachthelferin. Communications operator. The American corporal typed this information onto a form with efficient keystrokes. He asked several more questions about her health, any injuries, whether she required immediate medical attention. The questions were clinical, professional, completely devoid of the malice Greta had been trained to expect. It unsettled her more than threats would have. After processing, they were led upstairs to what had been classrooms, now converted into barracks. Bunk beds lined the walls. The room was clean, orderly, and equipped with basic necessities: thin mattresses, blankets, a single bathroom with running water. Greta claimed a lower bunk near the window and sat down heavily, her legs finally giving out. Margarethe took the bunk across from her. The older woman's face remained carefully neutral, but her eyes moved constantly, assessing everything. "This is not what I expected," Margarethe said quietly. Several other women murmured agreement. Liesel, who had stopped crying during processing, now looked simply confused. "Maybe they're waiting," another woman suggested, her voice tight with fear. "Maybe tonight, when we're locked in, they'll come." No one argued. The possibility felt horribly real. As evening fell, the door was locked from outside. An American guard, yet another black soldier, stood posted in the hallway. Through the door's small window, Greta could see him clearly. He didn't leer. He didn't make threatening gestures. He simply stood watch, professional and alert. Greta didn't sleep that night. Neither did most of the others. They lay in their bunks, listening to every sound, jumping at every footstep in the hallway. The propaganda had prepared them for violence. This waiting, this uncertainty, felt almost worse. When morning came, Greta was exhausted, terrified, and completely unprepared for what happened next. At 06:00 hours, the door unlocked. The same sergeant from yesterday, whose nameplate read Walker, appeared in the doorway. Behind him stood Corporal Johnson, the translator. "Morning roll call," Johnson announced in German. "Then you will proceed to the refectory for breakfast. Form 2 lines. Breakfast." They were talking about breakfast. The women moved like sleepwalkers, forming lines as instructed. Greta's mind couldn't process this. Where was the violence? Where was the assault she had been promised would come? Instead, they were being marched to breakfast like this was some kind of normal military operation. They walked down 2 flights of stairs and through hallways that still smelled faintly of chalk and old books. The refectory had been the school cafeteria. Long tables with benches filled the room. At the far end, a serving line had been set up with large metal containers of food, and standing behind that serving line, wearing kitchen whites over his uniform, was a black soldier with a serving spoon in his hand. Greta stopped walking. The woman behind her bumped into her back, but Greta couldn't move. Her brain refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. The black soldier, whose nameplate identified him as PFC Robert Hayes, smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of someone who had been up since before dawn preparing food, but it was genuine. He gestured toward the empty trays stacked at the beginning of the serving line. "Come on, ladies," Corporal Johnson translated. "Get your trays. Breakfast is ready." No one moved. 25 German women stood frozen in collective disbelief. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of trick, some elaborate psychological torture before the real horror began. Sergeant Walker's voice cut through the paralysis, firm but not unkind. "You need to eat. It's going to be a long day of processing and work assignments. The food won't get any warmer." Margaretti was the first to move. The nurse walked forward with deliberate steps, picked up a metal tray, and approached the serving line. Greta watched, holding her breath, expecting something terrible to happen. PFC Hayes scooped scrambled eggs onto Margarethi's tray. Real eggs, not the ersatz powder Greta had been eating for years. He added 2 slices of bread, a pat of margarine, and filled a tin cup with coffee. It smelled like acorn coffee, the wartime substitute, but it was hot and fresh. "Ma'am," Hayes said in English, his voice gentle. Johnson translated. "You need to eat. Long day ahead." Margarethi took her tray, moved to a table, and sat down. She stared at the food like it might vanish. One by one, the other women followed. Greta found herself in line, tray in trembling hands, approaching the serving line where this black soldier, this man she had been taught to fear as a monster, stood ready to serve her breakfast. When she reached him, Hayes looked at her directly. His eyes were brown, tired, but kind. He couldn't have been older than 25. He scooped eggs onto her tray with the same gentle efficiency he had shown Margarethi, added bread, poured coffee. Then he said something in English that Johnson didn't need to translate because the meaning was clear in his tone. "It's okay, miss. You're safe here." Greta's hand shook so badly she nearly dropped her tray. She stumbled to a table and sat down, staring at the food. Around her, other women did the same. The refectory filled with the sound of trays being set down, but no one ate. They simply stared. Liesel was the one who broke. The 17-year-old started crying, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the breakfast in front of her. Between sobs, she managed to speak in German, her voice carrying in the silent room. "We're Dakten, Earword, uns 10. We thought you would come to kill us." Corporal Johnson, standing near the serving line, heard her. His expression shifted, something between sadness and understanding crossing his face. He walked to the center of the room and spoke in clear German, making sure every woman heard him. "No one here will hurt you. You are prisoners of war, yes, but you are not animals. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention and basic human dignity. This is the United States Army. We have standards." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through every certainty Greta had ever held. She looked down at her breakfast. Steam rose from the eggs. The bread smelled fresh, the coffee was hot in her hands. Was not supposed to happen. According to everything she had been taught, everything she had believed for 3 years, this moment was impossible. Black soldiers were supposed to be savage, violent, incapable of restraint or civilization. They were supposed to be the nightmare the propaganda had promised. Instead, one had just served her breakfast. Greta picked up her fork with numb fingers and took a bite of eggs. They were real, warm, properly seasoned. Around her, other women began eating too, mechanical movements driven by hunger and confusion in equal measure. The refectory filled with the quiet sounds of meals being consumed by people whose worldview was actively shattering. Margarethi ate slowly, her eyes never leaving the American soldiers supervising the room. Greta could see the nurse's mind working, processing, analyzing. When she finished her meal, Margarethi leaned across the table and spoke in a whisper meant only for nearby ears. "The propaganda lied to us." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of revelation. Several women nodded slowly. Others looked away, unable or unwilling to accept what they were experiencing. Greta didn't know what to think. Her entire understanding of reality had been built on the foundation of Nazi racial ideology. The Reich's education system, its media, its leaders, all spoke with one voice about racial hierarchies and the dangers of inferior peoples. She had absorbed these teachings without question, the way a child absorbs language. Now that foundation was cracking, and she didn't know what would remain when it shattered completely. After breakfast, they were assigned work details. Nothing brutal, nothing designed to punish or degrade. The Americans needed the facility maintained, and prisoners provided labor. Greta was assigned to laundry duty with 10 other women. They spent the morning washing military uniforms and linens in large industrial machines that had once served the school. PFC Hayes appeared mid-morning with a cart carrying extra bread and margarine. He distributed portions to the working women, explaining through Johnson that they needed to maintain their strength. When he reached Greta, he offered her an extra slice with a small nod. "You look like you could use it, miss." Greta accepted the bread, her English too limited and her confusion too great for any response. Hayes moved on without expecting one. Over the following days, a routine established itself. Morning roll call, breakfast in the refectory, work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, evening lockdown. The pattern was military precise, organized, and utterly devoid of the horrors Greta had been promised. The cognitive dissonance created an almost physical pain in her chest. On the third day, Greta attempted English for the first time. When Hayes served her breakfast, she managed 2 words. "Thank you." His face broke into a genuine smile. "You're welcome, miss. You speak good." It was a small moment, barely worth noting in the grand scheme of war and captivity. But for Greta, it represented something profound. She had just thanked a black man and received a kind response. Such an interaction wasn't supposed to be possible. According to Nazi ideology, it violated the natural order of racial hierarchy. Yet it had happened, and the world hadn't ended. Margarethi noticed these small interactions. The nurse seemed to be conducting her own private study of their captors, watching everything with clinical attention. On the 4th evening after dinner, she pulled Greta aside in the barracks. "Have you noticed how they treat us?" Margarethi asked quietly, not just politely, with actual dignity. "They ensure we have sanitary supplies, medical care, adequate food, basic respect." Greta nodded slowly. She had noticed. It was impossible not to notice. Margarethi continued, her voice dropping even lower. "I served in field hospitals on the Eastern Front for 2 years before my transfer here. I saw how we treated Soviet prisoners. I saw how the Wehrmacht operated in occupied territories. The contrast is ... double quotes," she trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. But Greta understood. The contrast was damning. On the 5th day, Corporal Johnson appeared in the laundry room with a German-language newspaper. It was published by Allied occupation authorities, filled with news the Reich had never shared with its citizens. The front page showed photographs from recently liberated concentration camps. Greta had heard whispers about camps, about deportations, about the disappearance of Jewish neighbors and other undesirables. But the official line had always been labor relocation, wartime security measures, nothing more. The photographs told a different story. Emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors who looked like walking skeletons. Evidence of industrial-scale murder. "This is what we were fighting for?" someone whispered, staring at the images. "This is what the Reich was doing?" Johnson left the newspaper without comment. Over the next hour, every woman in the laundry room studied those photographs with mounting horror. Some cried. Others stood silent, faces gray. Margarethi's hands trembled as she held the paper. "They lied to us about everything," the nurse whispered. "The enemy, the war, our own government's crimes. Everything." That evening, during dinner, Greta found herself watching the black soldiers who supervised the refectory with new eyes. These men served a country that treated them as second-class citizens. She had learned this from Johnson during a brief conversation days earlier. America practiced segregation. Black soldiers couldn't eat in certain restaurants, couldn't stay in certain hotels, faced discrimination and violence in their own communities. Yet here they were, thousands of miles from home, fighting against Nazi tyranny while facing injustice at home. And despite everything they had every right to be angry about, they treated German prisoners with professionalism and basic human decency. The contrast between what they endured and how they behaved created a question Greta couldn't ignore. That evening, after the meal ended and prisoners were preparing to return to barracks, she approached Corporal Johnson. Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to speak in her limited English, supplemented with German when vocabulary failed her. "Corporal Johnson, may I ask you something?" He turned, surprise flickering across his face. In 5 days, this was the first time any of the German women had initiated a conversation beyond basic necessity. "Of course, Fräulein Weber. What's on your mind?" Greta struggled to find words that could carry the weight of her confusion. Finally, she spoke in a mixture of English and German, knowing he would understand. Why do you treat us with kindness? We were your enemies. Our country did terrible things. And your own country, it doesn't treat you fairly either. Why show us mercy? Johnson's expression shifted. For a long moment he said nothing, and Greta worried she had offended him. Then he gestured to a nearby bench. Sit down. This answer needs time. Greta sat. Johnson joined her, maintaining proper distance, his posture military correct even in this informal conversation. You're right about all of it, he began, speaking slowly to ensure she understood his English. Back home in Harlem, that's in New York City, I can't eat in certain restaurants, can't stay in certain hotels. My mother has to use separate water fountains, separate everything, just because of the color of her skin. The country I'm fighting for treats me like I'm less than human sometimes. He paused, his eyes distant, seeing something far beyond this converted school in Bavaria. German prisoners of war, when they're shipped to camps in the United States, they get treated better than black American soldiers. They can eat in restaurants where we're not welcome. Can you imagine that? We're fighting to defeat your country, and your soldiers as prisoners get better treatment than we do as free men. Greta felt shame burn through her chest. She hadn't known. How could she have known? But ignorance felt like a poor excuse. Johnson continued, his voice gaining quiet intensity. But you know what? That doesn't mean I abandon what's right. Treating prisoners with dignity isn't about whether you deserve it. It's about who we choose to be. Your propaganda told you we were savages. Our country sometimes treats us like we are, but we're soldiers. We're men. We maintain standards because that's what separates us from the evil we're fighting. He looked directly at Greta, and she saw something in his eyes that made her want to cry. Not anger, not bitterness, something harder to name. Determination, maybe, or defiant humanity. You don't beat someone because you can. You don't abuse power just because you have it. You show restraint and dignity because that makes you better than those who don't. The Reich taught you that some people are inferior by nature. We're proving that's a lie, not with words, but with actions. We're showing you what actual civilization looks like. Greta absorbed this in silence. Around them, other prisoners were filing out toward the barracks, but no one interrupted this moment. Even Sergeant Walker, supervising the evening routine, gave them space. I am ashamed, Greta finally said in German, then struggled to find English words. I believed the propaganda. I thought terrible things, and you were the one teaching me what honor means. Johnson's expression softened slightly. That's not your fault, Fraulein. You were fed lies from childhood. Recognizing those lies takes courage. What you do with that recognition, that's what matters now. The conversation ended when the evening roll call was announced. Greta returned to her barracks with Johnson's words echoing in her mind. That night she lay awake again, but not from fear, from the weight of transformation happening inside her own consciousness. Over the following weeks, small acts of kindness accumulated like drops of water slowly filling a vessel. Hayes brought extra rations when someone looked particularly weak. Walker arranged for a medic when one prisoner developed a fever. Johnson helped compose letters home when some prisoners were eventually allowed limited, censored correspondence. None of these actions were dramatic or heroic. They were simply decent. And they were devastating to everything Greta had been taught to believe. In mid-June, Greta was permitted to write a letter to her family in Hamburg. The letter would be read by American censors, so she chose her words carefully. But she managed to convey what mattered most. Mother, I am safe and treated well by my captors. Everything we were told about the American Negro soldiers was lies. They are professional, kind, and more honorable than I was taught to believe. I am ashamed of what I believe. I am ashamed of what our country did. When I come home, I will tell you everything. Please know that I am learning what truth actually looks like. It is painful, but necessary. The letter was approved and sent. It would reach Hamburg in October, after the war's end, after the mail system partially recovered. Her mother would read it sitting in the ruins of their bombed apartment building, and she would cry for reasons that had nothing to do with destroyed buildings. By August 1945, the war was over. Germany had surrendered months earlier, and now came the long process of repatriation, occupation, and reconstruction. The women prisoners were scheduled for release and return to their shattered homeland. For many, the prospect brought no joy. They would be returning to devastation, starvation, and a future more uncertain than anything they had known. On the final morning, breakfast proceeded like always. The routine had become familiar, almost comfortable. Greta walked through the serving line one last time, and Hayes served her eggs, bread, and coffee, with the same gentle efficiency he had shown on that first shocking morning months ago. Greta had prepared something for this moment. Using paper scrounged from work details and a pencil borrowed from a guard, she had drawn a simple thank you card. Her artistic skills were limited, but she had done her best. A simple drawing of hands passing food across a table, and words in both German and English. "Thank you for teaching me about dignity." She handed it to Hayes when she reached the end of the serving line. He looked surprised, turning the card over in his hands, studying the crude drawing and careful lettering. His eyes grew bright. "Miss Weber, this is ... Thank you. I'll keep this." Greta managed a small smile, her first genuine smile in months. "You showed me what honor means when no one else would." After breakfast, the prisoners assembled for departure. Trucks waited to transport them to repatriation centers. Sergeant Walker conducted final roll call, his voice carrying the same firm professionalism it had held since that first terrifying day of capture. Before boarding the trucks, Margarethe approached Walker. The nurse stood straight, shoulders back, and offered her hand. Walker shook it, maintaining eye contact. "Sergeant Walker," Margarethe said in careful English, "thank you for showing us what honor actually means." Walker's expression remained neutral, but Greta saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement. "Ma'am, we didn't do anything special. We treated you like prisoners of war should be treated. With dignity. That's the standard." He paused, then added, "Maybe when you go home, you'll remember that the men you were taught to fear showed you more humanity than the regime you served. Maybe you'll build something better." Margarethe nodded slowly. "I will try. We all will try." The trucks pulled away, carrying 25 German women back toward a homeland that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Through the canvas opening, Greta watched the facility disappear behind them. She thought about Hayes serving breakfast, Johnson patiently translating and teaching, Walker maintaining standards even when no one would have questioned otherwise. Germany lay in ruins. The Reich had fallen. Everything Greta had believed had been proven false. But in that devastation, she carried something new. A lesson taught not through lectures or propaganda, but through the simple act of men choosing to be better than the hatred directed at them. The historical record shows what happened next. The 761st Tank Battalion received recognition for their service, though it took decades. Presidential unit citation finally came in 1978, long after most veterans had grown old or died. The black soldiers who served with such distinction returned to an America that still practiced segregation, still denied them basic rights, still treated them as second-class citizens despite their sacrifice. German prisoners of war, interviewed years later, frequently mention the humane treatment they received, particularly from black American units. Many became advocates for democracy and civil rights in post-war Germany, their perspectives transformed by the contradiction of being treated with dignity by men who faced injustice at home. Greta Weber returned to Hamburg and found her family's apartment building reduced to rubble. She worked odd jobs, learned English, and eventually became a translator for Allied occupation forces. In 1951, she immigrated to the United States and settled in New York, where she worked tirelessly for civil rights causes. She never forgot that morning when she expected death and received breakfast instead. In a 1987 interview, elderly and gray-haired but still sharp-minded, Greta reflected on those days. "For 19 years, I believed terrible lies. In 5 days, black American soldiers taught me more about human dignity than a lifetime of Nazi propaganda. They had every reason to hate us. We had been their enemies. Their own country treated them unjustly. Instead of revenge, they served us breakfast." That simple act demolished everything I had been taught to believe. It showed me that propaganda dies when confronted with basic human decency. It taught me that civilization isn't about racial superiority or national mythology. It's about how you treat people when you have power over them. It's about choosing to be better than the hatred surrounding you. The breakfast table in that converted school refectory is long gone. The building was demolished in the 1960s to make room for new construction. The men who served food that morning have mostly passed away. But the lesson remains, preserved in testimonies and archives, and the transformed lives of those who experienced it. In April 1945, propaganda met reality across a breakfast table. Fear encountered kindness. Indoctrination confronted truth. The result wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was simply a group of exhausted black soldiers maintaining professional standards, treating prisoners with basic dignity, and, in doing so, defeating Nazi racial ideology more thoroughly than any battle could have achieved. They proved through actions that the content of character matters infinitely more than the color of skin. They demonstrated that true strength lies not in domination, but in restraint. They showed that even in war's brutality, humanity can survive and even flourish when people choose to uphold it. The Third Reich built its entire ideology on the premise of racial hierarchy. It took 12 years, millions of deaths, and a world war to destroy that evil regime. But for 25 German women in a Bavarian school building, the ideology died over breakfast, served by men who had every reason to hate but chose dignity instead. That choice, repeated in countless small moments across the chaos of war's end, represented something more powerful than any weapon. It represented the indomitable human capacity to choose goodness, even when surrounded by reasons to choose otherwise. History remembers the big battles, the famous generals, the dramatic turning points. But sometimes, the most important victories happen in quiet refectories, where breakfast is served with kindness, where propaganda dies in the face of simple human decency, and where the future is shaped one meal, one conversation, one small act of dignity at a time. This is one of those stories, not famous but true, not dramatic but profound, a testament to the power of choosing to be better, even when the world gives you every excuse not to be. If this story moved you, help us share these forgotten moments of history. Hit that subscribe button to join our community dedicated to uncovering the real human stories behind historical events. Drop a like if you believe these lessons about dignity, humanity, and breaking through propaganda still matter today. And please, leave a comment below. We want to hear from you. What struck you most about this story? Do you know similar accounts of humanity prevailing in dark times? Your thoughts and perspectives enrich our understanding of history. Remember, every subscription, like, and comment helps the algorithm share these important stories with people who need to hear them. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about moments like these, where ordinary people made extraordinary choices. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.